I'm Dave Butler. It's 2017. Let's look at profit and HCA. Obviously, the key thing we're going to look at when thinking about HCA's profit is its P&L, right there on page F3. Let's start with some margin and percentage of revenues type calculations to get a sense of this year compared with last year. To begin with, net margin, that's net income attributable to HCA Holdings, Inc., divided by revenues, rose from 5.4% in 2015 to 7.0% in 2016. That's a noteworthy improvement for a low-margin business and the backdrop to other math we'll do and questions we'll ask. Let's just run down the P&L with our eyes and look for big differences between this year and last year. To begin with, provisions for doubtful accounts appears to have spiked in 2015 at 9.0% of revenue before provisions. Think about that. In 2015, if HCA billed $100, it expected to collect $91. On its face, that seems high, and HCA has managed that percentage down to 7.3% in 2016. When we search for the phrase doubtful accounts in the annual report, we find this statement on page 65 that the provision for doubtful accounts and the allowance for doubtful accounts relate primarily to uninsured amounts due directly from patients, including copayment and deductible amounts for patients who have health care coverage. So in other words, we had higher doubtful accounts in 2015 relating to the amounts due directly from patients. But I don't see an explanation of why the numbers improved in 2016. So that's a question I might ask my contact. Hey, your doubtful accounts declined, though your revenues went up. Does this reflect a change in the mix of your business? Do you expect further mix changes in the future? How can Novo Nordisk and I help you with that? When looking at a hospital's financials, you always want to look at the line salaries and benefits. It's their biggest expense. HCA appears to have managed that number quite consistently, with salaries and benefits declining slightly as a percentage of revenue from 45.6 to 45.5%. Most of the rest of the operating costs similarly come in quite close to 2015's number as a percentage of revenues. It gets interesting when we get to the legal claim costs benefits line. Those parentheses mean that last year HCA had a $250 million cost, and this year it had a gain of a similar amount from litigation. If I search in the annual report for the word litigation, I get a discussion of the Health Midwest litigation on pages 46 and 47. Now here's a key for thinking through this. The deal with litigation expense is that you write down a cost in your P&L, not when you actually pay the fine or the settlement, but when you decide it's more likely than not that you will have to pay. And you call that cost a provision. You're providing for a future payment you're going to have to make. With that in mind, the basic story with the Health Midwest litigation is HCA accruing cost as it goes along, still litigating and appealing even though it expects it will more likely than not have to pay. And at the end, HCA and the plaintiffs reach an agreement that is better for HCA than HCA expected. And so it gets to reverse some of its previous provisions. It gets to take back some of the costs. So that $246 million in the P&L represents a real thing, but not an obvious thing. It doesn't mean that someone else paid HCA $246 million. Instead, it means that HCA learned it was going to have to pay $246 million less than it had previously expected. Really, that means that in terms of the underlying operations, HCA's margin this year slightly overstates how good a year 2016 was, and 2015's margin slightly understates. That in itself may not give you much to talk to in a customer conversation. Look at page 46 again, though, and see the underlying facts. The plaintiff alleged that it sold hospitals to HCA and that part of the deal was that HCA committed to levels of CapEx to keep the hospitals up to date and to providing certain amounts of uncompensated care. Presumably, HCA breached the agreement or it wouldn't have ended up having to pay as much as it did. So that raises talking points that might be useful in a customer conversation. Do you have other uncompensated care and CapEx commitments? Is that usual in your acquisitions, of which you make many, by the way? To what extent does this push HCA away from acquiring nonprofit healthcare providers, which may make such demands on it? How can Novo Nordisk help HCA meet similar commitments in the future or avoid them in negotiation, for instance, by allowing the same standard of care to be delivered but with less capital expenditure? I want to point you now to another section of the annual report that's very interesting. For U.S. public companies, it's called Item 7, Management's Discussion and Analysis of Financial Condition and Results of Operations. And because that's a mouthful, it's usually referred to in speech as the MD&A. In HCA's annual report, it starts on page 52. There's a lot here, including discussion of business strategy, sources of liquidity, tax situation, off-balance sheet arrangements, and more. For today, I just want to point you at the Results of Operations section that begins on page 60 and runs through page 69. This is where HCA's management explains the annual results. Candidly, some of this just regurgitates the P&L, but some of it adds new information. Let me point out only one thing for now. We'll come back again when we talk about growth. Pages 62 and 63 have a discussion of Florida and Texas. It turns out these two states loom large in HCA's results. The first paragraph tells us that they account for about half the company's revenues and admissions. It turns out that Florida and Texas have higher rates of uninsured admissions, too, since they account for just under 70% of HCA's uninsured admissions over the last 2 years. This in itself may be interesting, especially if you deal with HCA facilities in those states. What is driving the high rates of uninsured admissions? How can Novo Nordisk help? Is there space where, for instance, an easier-to-take diabetes treatment might increase adherence among indigent populations? Also interesting is the page-long description of Texas's Medicaid waiver program, which covers indigent care in the state and incentivizes reform of healthcare delivery systems. Payments pursuant to these initiatives drive a little less than 10% of HCA's revenues, and if the waiver expires as scheduled at the end of 2017, that revenue may be at risk. What are the HCA facilities in Texas doing about the risk? How can Novo Nordisk support its customer?